There was a moment in the 1980s when the Mustang's future came down to a single decision. Keep building it the way enthusiasts loved. Rear-wheel drive, V8 optional, unapologetically American. Or scrap the formula entirely and replace it with a front-wheel drive coupe developed with Mazda. Ford seriously considered the second option. And if you think that sounds like an alternate timeline, it's not. It almost happened. So if you appreciate the stories behind the cars, the moments where everything could have gone differently, hit subscribe, because this is one of those turning points that reshaped the industry. But before the outrage, before the leaked plans, before the letters flooded Ford's headquarters, the Mustang had a problem. Sales were slipping, the market was shifting, and the pressure was real. The 1980s performance crisis. At the end of the 1970s, the Mustang was still selling in healthy numbers. In 1979, Ford moved roughly 370,000 units. But by 1983, sales had dropped off a cliff to around 120,000. Why the drop? Part of it was timing. The oil crisis of the 1970s had permanently shifted buyer priorities. Fuel efficiency suddenly mattered more than quarter-mile times. Insurance premiums for performance cars had climbed. Emissions regulations squeezed engines tighter every year. And while the Fox body Mustang was lighter and more modern than its Mustang II predecessor, it still represented a traditional American formula, a front-engine, rear-wheel drive design with an optional V8. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Honda, Toyota, and Nissan were flooding the US market with front-wheel drive cars that felt modern, efficient, and precise. Cars like the Honda Prelude and Toyota Celica weren't muscle cars, but they handled well, sipped fuel, and didn't feel like relics of the carburetor era. Younger buyers were noticing. Inside Ford, the math didn't look great. The Mustang still had a loyal following, but loyalty doesn't always offset shrinking volume. If imports continued gaining ground and domestic performance kept losing relevance, what would the Mustang look like 5 years down the road? Executives weren't thinking about nostalgia. They were thinking about survival. And when companies start thinking about survival, they're willing to question sacred things, including the Mustang formula itself. The ST16 project. By the mid-1980s, Ford's relationship with Mazda had deepened significantly. Ford had acquired a substantial ownership stake in the Japanese automaker, and the two companies were sharing engineering resources and platforms. Mazda brought expertise in lightweight, front-wheel drive chassis design. Ford brought scale and access to the North American market. That partnership opened a door. Instead of developing an entirely new rear-wheel drive Mustang platform from scratch, which would be expensive, Ford could leverage Mazda's front-wheel drive architecture. The specific project that emerged became known internally as ST16. The idea wasn't lazy. It was calculated. Build a sleek, modern coupe on Mazda's G platform. Give it sharp handling. Offer 4-cylinder engines, possibly turbocharged. Improve fuel economy. Reduce weight. Make it feel competitive with Japanese sports coupes instead of fighting a shrinking muscle car segment. From a corporate perspective, it made sense. But here's where things get complicated. To the engineers and planners pushing ST16 forward, the Mustang name was a powerful brand that could carry this new direction. They weren't trying to disrespect history. They believed they were future-proofing it. The thinking was simple. If buyers are moving toward front-wheel drive, then the Mustang should move with them. The problem is that a Mustang isn't just a product, it's a symbol. Rear-wheel drive was part of the identity. The available V8 wasn't just an engine option, it was the heartbeat. The backlash. In 1987, the story broke. An industry publication revealed that Ford was planning to replace the rear-wheel drive Mustang with a front-wheel drive coupe developed alongside Mazda. It wasn't framed as a rumor. It was presented as a direction. And that was enough. The reaction was immediate. Ford began receiving letters by the thousands. Owners, club members, longtime loyalists, people who had grown up with small block V8s and smoky burnouts made it clear they felt betrayed. This wasn't resistance to change for the sake of it. It was resistance to losing the very traits that defined the car. Dealers added pressure of their own. They understood their buyers. A front-wheel drive Mustang, no matter how refined, would be a hard sell to the crowd that kept the name alive through the lean years. Inside Ford, the debate intensified. On one side were planners who believed the market shift toward front-wheel drive was irreversible. On the other were executives and engineers who understood the emotional weight attached to the Mustang badge. In the end, the traditionalists prevailed. Ford made the call to keep the Mustang rear-wheel drive and continue developing it independently. The Fox platform would evolve instead of being replaced outright. The V8 would survive. The formula would remain intact. But the ST16 project didn't vanish. Ford had already invested heavily. There were contracts with Mazda. Tooling was underway. Walking away entirely wasn't realistic. So instead of replacing the Mustang, the car would enter the market under a different name, and that's how the Ford Probe was born. The birth of the Probe. The name Probe had already been used on a series of futuristic Ford concept cars in the late 1970s and early 1980s, aerodynamic, experimental vehicles that hinted at modern design thinking. The badge felt forward-looking, technical, almost space-age. That worked perfectly for what this new coupe was supposed to represent. The production Ford Probe launched for the 1989 model year. Underneath, it shared its foundation with the Mazda 626 and MX-6. It was front-wheel drive. The suspension tuning carried Mazda's influence. The architecture was compact, efficient, and far removed from traditional American pony car proportions. Visually, though, it didn't look like a compromise. The first-generation Probe had a sleek, low-slung profile with pop-up headlights and smooth, aerodynamic lines that fit the late 80s design language perfectly. It didn't try to mimic the Mustang. It leaned into a different personality, more import-inspired sport coupe than domestic muscle. Ford positioned it accordingly. The Probe wasn't marketed as a muscle car. It was aimed squarely at competitors like the Honda Prelude and Toyota Celica, buyers who wanted style and agility without the bulk or thirst of a V8 coupe. Crucially, the Mustang and Probe were sold side by side. One represented heritage. The other represented a modern direction. For a moment, it seemed like Ford had managed to split the difference, protect the Mustang while still chasing the market shift toward front-wheel drive performance. The question was whether the Probe could stand on its own. How the Probe actually drove strip away the controversy for a second, and the Probe deserves to be judged as a car. The base engine in the first generation was a Mazda-sourced 2.2-liter four-cylinder. It was efficient and smooth, but not especially quick. The more interesting option was the turbocharged version of that same 2.2-liter engine in the GT trim. With around 145 horsepower in late 80s form, it gave the lightweight coupe respectable punch for its time. There was also Ford's 3.0-liter Vulcan 5.6 available in certain configurations, more torque-focused than high revving, giving the car a different character depending on spec. By the time the second generation arrived in 1993, the formula sharpened. The styling became more sculpted and aggressive. Under the hood, buyers could opt for a 2.0-liter four-cylinder or a 2.5-liter double overhead cam V6, producing around 164 horsepower. That V6, paired with a 5-speed manual, could push the Probe to 60 miles per hour in the mid-7-second range. Competitive territory in the sport coupe segment of the era. Handling was where the car quietly impressed people. Thanks to its Mazda-developed chassis, the Probe felt balanced and predictable. Turn-in was sharp. Body roll was controlled. For drivers coming from domestic coupes of the early 80s, It felt genuinely modern. It didn't deliver tail-happy theatrics, but it rewarded smooth inputs and carried speed confidently through corners. And that's what makes this story interesting. The Probe wasn't a bad car. In many ways, it was exactly what Ford's planners had intended: efficient, stylish, and capable of competing with imports on their own terms. Its problem wasn't engineering. It was identity. It entered the world as the car that almost replaced a legend. And even though it never wore the Mustang badge, that shadow followed it from day one. Sales, hype, and the slow fade. When the Probe hit showrooms in 1989, in its first full year, Ford moved well over 100,000 units. For a sporty coupe in that era, that was a strong start. The buyers were curious. The styling felt fresh. The import fighter positioning made sense. And for people who never cared about V8 rumble to begin with, the Probe simply looked like a sharp, modern car. But momentum is fragile. As the early 90s rolled in, the landscape shifted again. The SN95 Mustang debuted for 1994, bringing updated styling and a renewed sense of purpose to Ford's traditional pony car. Suddenly, the Mustang felt modern again, without abandoning rear-wheel drive. That siphoned attention away from the Probe. At the same time, competition in the front-wheel drive sport coupe segment intensified. Japanese brands refined their offerings. Power crept upward. Interiors improved. The Probe wasn't falling apart, it just wasn't dominating anything either. Sales began to taper. By the mid-1990s, numbers were sliding sharply. The second-generation car had arguably better proportions and stronger performance, but it never quite shook the perception problem. To some buyers, it was still the almost Mustang. To others, it was simply one option in a crowded field. By 1997, Ford pulled the plug. The Mustang carried on. The Probe quietly exited. And for years, it became little more than a footnote in the Mustang's survival story. The hidden gems. But time has a funny way of reshaping reputations. For a long stretch, the Probe lived in an awkward middle ground. Not old enough to be classic, not new enough to be relevant. But today, enthusiasts are starting to look at it with fresh eyes. Certain trims, especially the GT models with the 2.5-liter V6 and manual transmission, offer something appealing: a lightweight 90s coupe with clean lines and analog driving feel. No driver modes, no artificial exhaust, just a responsive chassis and a rev-happy engine. Well-preserved turbo first-generation cars have become especially interesting. They represent a specific late 80s moment: pop-up headlights, digital-era optimism, and a time when turbo badges carried real mystique. The aftermarket scene, while never massive, carved out its own niche. Some owners leaned into the import tuner aesthetic of the era. Others kept their cars stock, appreciating the Mazda engineering underneath the Ford badge. And here's the truth. When you judge the Probe without the Mustang comparison, it stands up better than many people expected. It was balanced. It was reasonably quick for its day. It looked the part. Its legacy was overshadowed, not undeserved. Outro today, when you see a modern Mustang, whether it's a V8 GT, a track-focused dark horse, or even the new hybrid discussions swirling around, it's easy to assume its DNA was inevitable. It wasn't. There was a moment when accountants and planners nearly redirected that DNA entirely. A moment when front-wheel drive and four-cylinder practicality almost replaced burnout culture and rear-drive balance. The Ford Probe is the artifact from that alternate timeline. It's the physical reminder that the Mustang's survival wasn't guaranteed. It was argued for, defended, demanded. And maybe that's what makes the Mustang story stronger, because the legend didn't survive by accident. It survived because people cared enough to fight for what it was supposed to be. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the strangest crossroads in automotive history, stick around. There are plenty more stories where a single decision could have changed everything.